Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, the softball interviews shaping the world.
What's your go-to at McDonald's?
No, I'll tell you, Burger King. We did the double,
Whopper?
The double.
I haven't ripped Burger King in a long time.
You like Burger King over McDonald's?
That's your worst take.
Why politicians like Donald Trump, Kamala Harris, and Benjamin Netanyahu are choosing to speak to influencers over journalists. I'm Manuel Rapalo, and this is The Take.
My name is Nathan Robinson. I am an author and the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine based in New Orleans.
Nathan, welcome back to The Take. I'm going to start by playing a few clips from an interview that recently lit up the internet.
I hope you and President Trump can make peace in the Middle East. We're all praying for it.
We already have, and I'm sure we can again. And look, if your audience wants to have a good time,
Go to Tel Aviv.
Yeah, you can vouch for it.
Is that what you're going to say?
Isn't Tel Aviv?
Oh,
right?
yeah, Tel Aviv's lit.
Yeah, it's fun.
Tel Aviv's on fire.
This is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu appearing on the Full Send podcast hosted by the Nelk Boys. The Nelk Boys are influencers that have sort of made a name for themselves pulling pranks on YouTube. They've since become minor celebrities within the world of the Make America Great Again movement here in the United States. And now here they are interviewing Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on their podcast. Obviously, the internet had a lot to say about this. And Nathan, so did you. You wrote an article, a piece called The Rise of the Idiot Interviewer. So for people that haven't watched this interview, I had never heard of the Nelk Boys before. I made it a point to watch this podcast. How would you describe it?
Well, it is, as many podcasts are, a 70 or so minute casual conversation, right? So it's very informal, very relaxed. I don't know that the Nelk Boys came with that many questions beforehand that they wanted to ask. And most of the time, Netanyahu is talking, right? They don't actually say that much. They interject now and then. They clearly feel a little out of their depth, a little starstruck, a little overwhelmed by the fact that they are YouTube pranksters interviewing a world leader. And Netanyahu, basically, other than some of the little banter stuff about Burger King and the nightlife in Tel Aviv, repeats talking points that we've heard a lot from both him and other members of the Israeli government about the fact that Israel faces existential threats, talking about how, in the Arab world they execute gay people, about how Hamas steals all the food, et cetera, et cetera.
I'm not claiming to be an expert too, but I'll just read stuff on X and people will say Israel's killing babies or they're starving people.
That's completely false. In fact, the reason we have civilian casualties in Gaza is because Hamas, who are basically horrible murderers and killers, committed to our destruction and your destruction.
A lot of the standard talking points, he goes through them at great length, and the Nelk Boys don't really, they give him space. I would say that the interview mostly consists of the Nelk Boys giving Netanyahu space to monologue on the topics of his choice.
And Nathan, this isn't the first time that we've seen an indie podcast get this sort of opportunity to interview a very high level or high profile guest on a show. A big name politician like Benjamin Netanyahu is no small get in the world of booking people for a TV show or a podcast. But this is part of a larger trend, isn't it? What are some other examples that we can point to recently?
Well, we have seen in the 2024 campaign, Donald Trump made a conscious effort to go on podcasts. He went on Lex Friedman's podcast, Joe Rogan's podcast.
To me, the most beautiful word, and I've said this for the last couple of weeks, in the dictionary today, is the word tariff. It's more beautiful than love. It's more beautiful than anything. It's the most beautiful word.
Vice President J.D. Vance went on Theo Vaughn's podcast. Kamala Harris picked her own friendly interviewer. She picked the Call Her Daddy podcast.
I'm curious, you don't do too many long-form interviews. What made you want to do Call Her Daddy today?
Well, I think you and your listeners have really got this thing right, which is one of the best ways to communicate with people is to be real, and to talk about the things that people really care about.
So these kind of informal, long-form conversations with politicians, we're starting to see more and more.
And do you get the sense this sort of thing is happening exclusively in the sort of right-wing male-hosted podcast? Or are there instances of more centrist or left-leaning podcasters getting these same opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, I gave the example of Kamala Harris going on the Call Her Daddy podcast. That was clearly an effort in the Harris campaign to think. I mean, they saw that that Trump had this manosphere, and they said, well, okay, this clearly is an effective way to reach people. Who could we pick who has a kind of Harris-friendly audience? And that was a good podcast for them to pick.
I want to ask you why this is happening, because it does, as we pointed out, appear to be a trend here. It's my understanding that the Nelk Boys said that it was the White House that approached them about doing this interview. Now, the White House, as far as I understand, has not commented about this yet. But why are we seeing world leaders like President Trump, like Prime Minister Netanyahu, choosing to go on these types of shows?
Well, the obvious answer is because they perceive that it will be to their advantage to go on these shows, right? I don't think Donald Trump has a natural inclination to hang out with Joe Rogan. What he understood is that Joe Rogan has the #1 podcast in the world, that he's listened to, that his audience sees him as a kind of voice of reason, as someone who is politically independent, and that if Donald Trump could go on the program, that he could win people over. And indeed, if you look at the comments sections of these podcasts, you see why politicians do it, because you see lots of people in reaction to Trump on Rogan or Friedman saying, wow, our president, I can't imagine other politicians going for 3 hours just talking like this. And, he's so natural. He's so human. The same with J.D. Vance on Theo Vaughn. I mean, politicians really want to seem human. And so it's a great way to go on. And if you can do it for 90 minutes, 2 hours, 3 hours, just sit and chat with someone who's friendly, you get a huge public relations win.
I will say, though, that in this particular case, with the Netanyahu interview, Prime Minister Netanyahu said that he went on the podcast to reach out to young Americans because young Americans are getting the quote-unquote wrong picture about Israel. There's a poll that we can point to, and maybe the Nelk Boys could have benefited from seeing this poll themselves, that only 9% of respondents under the age of 35 say that they approve of Israel's military action in Gaza, and 6% say that they have a favorable opinion of the prime minister himself.
Israel has a public relations problem, right? Which is that public opinion in the United States and around the world after Israel's since October 2023 has been pulverizing Gaza, killing tens of thousands of people, destroying every piece of infrastructure. This all occurs in the context of what all the major international human rights organizations, Doctors Without Borders, Amnesty, Oxfam, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, Physicians for Human Rights, have all now unanimously called a genocide in Gaza. Right? Benjamin Netanyahu is wanted by the International Criminal Court. It is no longer controversial. Netanyahu knows he has a PR problem. And so this is clearly an effort to address the PR problem. He says, well, who's a friendly interviewer who has an audience among the kind of people who risk turning against Israel? And how can I speak to those people, explain our side of the story so that we start moving them back towards sympathy with Israel?
And there is a war of words playing out across the media, but this trend also does seem to coincide with funding cuts at major news organizations like PBS, NPR here in the United States, the traditional interview shows like BBC's Hard Talk being canceled.
Yeah.
Do you think the disappearance of these more rigorous forms of journalism, is also factoring into the rise of, for lack of a better term, these unserious alternatives?
Yeah, and we haven't even seen the impact of the funding cuts to NPR and PBS. This apocalypse of public media has yet to take place, so this is only going to get worse. Now, I try not to be too romantic about mainstream media because I think that interviewers, there are plenty of softball interviews in corporate media as well. But I think one of the real concerning facts about this kind of interview is that the interviewer doesn't even perceive of themselves as a journalist who has journalistic obligations and who has to do any research or who has to be independent. I mean, it's interesting in the Nelk Boys public comments on this. I mean, they sort of seem confused. They sort of go, I guess we're journalists now? I mean, maybe we're...
You make a good point when you say that there are plenty of instances that we can point to in the mainstream media where the same thing is happening. A very safe place is open to a controversial, high-profile guest. Maybe it's Netanyahu, maybe it's Trump, and it's not challenged. So do you think that maybe you're going a little too hard on these guys?
No, I'm not going too hard. No, absolutely not. I'm not going too hard on these guys. What I would caution against is blaming the medium. Right, because politicians are going to try and pick friendly interviewers, and they're going to find friendly interviewers on CNN, and they can find them on podcasts. You can also find really tough interviews in the independent media and podcast sphere, right? So I just watched Crystal Ball on Breaking Points with Totally Independent interviewing Senator Alyssa Slotkin.
I'm a YouTuber. You know, I have my words, that's all I have. Yeah. But you're a United States Senator. Mm-hmm. Like you're not the president, but you have power. So what are you going to do? Because so far what we've seen, I mean, you voted for some of the aid that's been used to massacre children and innocents.
She challenged her vigorously. She brought her facts. She did everything that a journalist should do. And so just because she's independent and runs a podcast doesn't mean that she can't be a really, really good, tough interviewer and journalist. So I would caution against blaming the medium. And the problem is not that they're podcasters sitting down for long-form conversations. The problem is that anyone who interviews a political leader, someone who is powerful, especially someone who has been accused of committing serious crimes and doesn't do their research and doesn't understand that their role as an interviewer is to make sure that the audience understands the facts and make sure that politician is challenged when they try and spin those facts.
More with Nathan Robinson after the break.
In 2014, Karen Rodriguez was kidnapped by one of Mexico's deadliest cartels. Her mum vowed to hunt them down and bring them to justice. We'll investigate this story and others from across the globe on True Crime Reports.
So, Nathan, the Nelk Boys have been in damage control mode since the Netanyahu interview. They did a 4-hour live stream responding to this backlash where they read through the comments and they admitted that they were not prepared for this interview. But ultimately, they don't seem to regret having Prime Minister Netanyahu on the show.
We're not the best journalists, never claimed to be, so we might not be the best at pressing them. But in my opinion, it's up to the viewer to form their own educated opinion.
So the Nelk Boys have said that they'll have anyone on their show. They'll have, I believe one of them said that their dream interview was to have Kim Jong-un on the show, but that they want the audience to decide for themselves. What do you say in response to this idea that viewers should be the ones making up their own minds?
Yeah, they also said at one point, because someone said this is like interviewing the modern day Hitler, and they said, oh, I guess it is like interviewing Hitler. But, make up your own mind.
Wow. Wow.
I think there's something they misunderstand there with this make up your own mind argument, which is very tempting, which is to say, look, all we're doing is letting Netanyahu speak. You're free to disagree with it. Now, the problem is that for the audience to have an educated opinion, the audience has to be aware of the facts that are not entering into that discussion. The Nelk Boys audience can be expected to be, I mean, as I say, because they're YouTube pranksters, a lot of them would probably be relatively apolitical people, right? They're people who probably a lot of them don't know that much about the Israel-Palestine conflict, right? So that when the Nelk Boys wade into the Israel-Palestine conflict, they have a responsibility. That responsibility is to give their audience the facts that allow them to form an educated opinion. And yes, you can let Netanyahu speak, he'll give his answers, but your job as an interviewer is to make sure that he doesn't get away with lying to your audience, because the audience is not going to know necessarily. Now, this is a pretty extreme case where the audience was so, it was so abhorrent what they did that the audience actually turned against them. But there are a lot of cases where, especially the Trump interviews on Rogan and Friedman, where Trump gets away with a lot of BS. And it's very clear the audience doesn't realize it's BS, because I go through those comments and they're like, wow, whoa.
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying. The only feeling that I get is there are moments where they do seem genuinely curious. In your piece, you wrote about how there are times when it is better for the interview to not be an expert, right? So, and I love the example that you give at the beginning of the article, which is if you had to choose between Neil deGrasse Tyson being interviewed by a fellow astrophysicist or by a 6-year-old, that many people might want to listen to the podcast where the 6-year-old is conducting the interview, because not all of us are astrophysicists, right? So, what is the difference between that and Netanyahu being interviewed by the Nelk Boys?
Yes, I'm not saying that interviewers have to be professionals or experts in the subjects that they have conversations about. You're an interviewer, I'm a professional interviewer too, and I actually find that if I know too much about the subject, it can actually make it more challenging to have a conversation that the audience is going to appreciate. You want to have a kind of naivete as an interviewer in some ways, because you are that attitude. And this is why people, Joe Rogan is a phenomenal interviewer, right? He's the #1 podcast for a reason. And part of it is that he is not that knowledgeable a guy, but he's a curious guy. He's a guy who's interested in people and just wants to find things out. Unfortunately, where he ends up interviewing people on issues that have consequences or issues where being naive means that your guest is going to get away with BS, with nonsense. So when he's interviewing someone who, for example, says that Atlantis was real, or where he's interviewing anti-vax people, then it's a real problem. And it's at its most serious as a problem when you are interviewing someone who is responsible for a genocide, right? Because there, when we're talking about, a child just having conversation about planets, that's all fun. There's not really any human stakes to that. But there's an active debate in the American legislature right now about whether to cut off weapons to Israel. And if you believe what Netanyahu says, you're going to be on one side of that. And if you don't believe him and you understand that he's lying and is in fact a war criminal, then you're going to be on another side of that. So there are consequences for people. And then you really do have a moral responsibility to be intelligent and informed.
You talk about the reaction that's taken place to this Netanyahu interview on the Nelk Boys podcast. They've been getting a lot of heat.
We have genocidal war criminals going on frat boy podcasts while the Gaza Palestinians are starving to death and getting shot at seeking aid.
What is the upside to having somebody like that on your podcast? There's zero upside. At this point, everybody sees through what is going on in the Middle East.
You're talking to a man who's currently created more child amputees than anyone else per capita in a region of the world.
They were criticized by their own fans too, and I believe they may have even lost a lot of subscribers. So I guess ultimately, who benefits from this? This seems like it was in some ways a loss for them, but what about for Netanyahu? Was this a win for him?
For Netanyahu, I think it was also a loss. I think it was a miscalculation on his part because Netanyahu, in his arrogance and confidence, believes that if only people were able to hear his side of the story, they would agree with him. That turns out to be false. He's actually not very effective at presenting Israel's side of the story and didn't manage to persuade people. I think the overwhelming dominant reaction was, wow, I can't believe you're having this horrible man on to just talk unchecked and you're not asking him any critical questions.
Interesting. So it had the opposite intended effect here.
So I think Netanyahu probably didn't feel like he got what he wanted out of that.
Okay, so maybe this didn't work this time for Prime Minister Netanyahu the way that he hoped. What is ultimately the danger here? And
if it always went like this Nelk Boys thing, then I wouldn't write about it because it would be fine, because it wouldn't work out for Netanyahu. But I think in most cases it has been great for politicians. Now, J.D. Vance and Theo Vaughn is an interesting case where Theo Vaughn is not someone who has done really his research. He's a kind of a good-hearted guy. He's called what's happening in Gaza a genocide, and he even challenged J.D. Vance on it and said, he didn't make the strongest statement, but he said, it seems to a lot of people like a genocide. And J.D. Vance said, well, it's not a genocide because they're not trying to kill all the Palestinians. Now, that's not the definition of a genocide. And if you understood a bit about the definition of a genocide, the interviewer could then respond and say, well, that's not why the human rights orgs have concluded this is genocide. But Theo Vaughn didn't do that. And so the problem there is that it allows J.D. Vance to respond with what sounds superficially like a potentially persuasive point. Now, the audience can think for themselves. They might see through this. They're going to get people in the comments. But the interviewer really has a responsibility to, when the interviewee says something that is false. And I've seen George Santos and Eric Adams, who are both, accused of crimes, go on podcasts and basically just spew their side of the story. And the interviewers, because they haven't dived into the case files, they don't really know how to respond.
No, and I'm glad you bring up Theo Vaughn, because a lot of his content slips into my algorithm, and I think that his that sort of combination are part of his charm. But what is your advice to these young podcasters, a lot of these folks who are in positions where they have platforms with tremendous influence and millions of followers? What's your advice to them on how they can be better?
My advice would be, you can't just be charming. You have to do your research. And if you're talking about serious subjects that have serious human consequences, you have to think to yourself, and you're talking to a politician, you have to not be naive. You can't be a child. You can't have a baby brain. You have to have an adult brain. And you have to think to yourself, why is this politician agreeing to talk to me? What do they want out of this? Let me think about what I need to do to make sure that I am not just acting as PR. And there's a very good piece of advice from Mehdi Hassan, who worked for Al Jazeera for many years, who wrote a great book called Win Every Argument. And he says he has the number one best piece of advice is bring the receipts.
Bring the receipts.
Bring the receipts. And you can see what he does. In fact, if you look at some of his old Al Jazeera interviews where he's literally got documents next to him, that's the kind of thing that you do. You use... you bring evidence. Your responsibility is to know everything about the topic so that you will know when you're being lied to.
Conclusion, also don't have a baby brain. There's so much more I'd love to unpack with you today, Nathan, but unfortunately that's all the time we have.
Well, hopefully we'll talk again.
Yes, hopefully we'll see you back here on The Take again soon. Nathan Robison, thank you again for joining us on The Take.
Thanks, Manny.
And that's The Take. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to give it a like so more people can find this episode. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know what stood out to you, or if there's anything you'd like us to dive deeper into next time. I'm always checking in, so let's keep the conversation going. And I'll see you tomorrow.